The Spitfire is a legend. Today, 60 years after it first entered service with the RAF, it still turns heads and raises emotions with its classic lines and the full-throated roar of its Merlin engine. But the Spitfire was more than just a good-looking aircraft. It was a killer, a fighter of immense character that became the chosen mount for many of the best fighter pilots the RAF could muster. But perhaps most important of all, the Spitfire's design allowed it to be developed constantly throughout its 10 years of manufacture. Bigger engines, more power, and improved armament kept the Spitfire in the front line well after its contemporaries had disappeared. It is not surprising, therefore, that every fighter to carry the RAF roundels since the war has been compared with the Spitfire. The genesis of the Spitfire's success lay in the abilities and leadership of two men: R.J. Mitchell, the chief designer of Supermarine Aviation, and Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce Engines. Their relationship had begun during the preparation for the 1929 Schneider Trophy race. Air racing was hugely popular, and the Schneider Trophy was the blue ribboned event in the racing calendar. Mitchell and Royce set out to create a world beater. The Supermarine S6 won that year, and in 1931 the S6B completed the trio of wins needed to secure the trophy for Britain forever. Three factors were significant in this win. First, the 1931 victory was accomplished without any government backing. Lady Houston, the widow of a shipping magnate, stepped in and donated £100,000 from her own pocket. Second, Mitchell had almost single-handedly brought the concept of the monoplane to the forefront of British aircraft design. Finally, and most worrying to the RAF, the S6B had won the race at a speed of 340 miles an hour and went on to break the world speed record just a few days later. At 407 miles an hour, this streamlined monoplane, powered by a privately built engine, had flown around 200 miles an hour faster than the RAF's fastest frontline fighter.
It left us with the design and aerodynamic knowledge to go on to high-speed aircraft. And of course from that, the Spitfire finally evolved.
Since the First World War, Britain's defence budgets had been small. Hugh Trenchard, the RAF's first commander, had spent his precious pounds on building a bomber force at the expense of fighters. This had stood him in good stead throughout the 1920s, when the RAF had virtually been in control of policing the British Empire. Trenchard, however, did understand the need for fighters. Light biplane bombers had quelled local uprisings in India and Iraq with ease, and it seemed that there was no need for faster and more expensive aircraft. But in the early 1930s, Europe was far from being a continent at peace. In Germany, Adolf Hitler came to power, pulled out of the Geneva Disarmament Conference, and declared that he would rebuild the Luftwaffe. In comparison to Britain, Hitler spent enormous sums of money on new aircraft and pilot training. The German civil airline, Lufthansa, and German gliding clubs had already become breeding grounds for the pilots who would spearhead the Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the RAF was resting on its laurels and undertaking exercises with lumbering heavy bombers, which could easily penetrate the fighter defences at 80 miles an hour. If Britain was to have any chance in a war with Germany, then something had to happen quickly. On the 21st of October 1933, Winston Churchill spoke to the House of Commons. "Germany is already well on her way to become, and must become, incomparably the most heavily armed nation in the world, and the nation most ready for war. We cannot have any anxieties comparable to the anxiety caused by German rearmament." In response to this, and the obvious warlike posture of Adolf Hitler, the British government gradually increased the defence budget. Equally important was the appointment of men such as Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding to positions of authority. He, amongst others, believed that not only could the bomber be stopped, but must be stopped. While the design of new monoplane bombers continued apace, he also pushed for new fighters. By 1933, Mitchell was already well advanced with the design of a new monoplane fighter in response to an Air Ministry specification. His entry was a gull-wing monoplane with a fixed undercarriage and open cockpit. It was powered by a Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine which used a complicated steam cooling device. But Mitchell was not happy. The Air Ministry ordered a biplane, the Gloucester Gladiator, and Mitchell went back to the drawing board. As Mitchell contemplated revolutionary design features to his airframe, so Rolls-Royce were designing a new privately funded engine, the PV-12. Using the research that had made the Schneider engine so successful, Rolls-Royce built a classic. New chemicals improved the fuels, and better fuels improved the superchargers. This meant that the engine could provide extra power at altitudes where normal engines ran out of steam in the thin air. New, stronger metals meant that the power could be sustained but at a fraction of the weight. The V-12 inline layout was liquid-cooled, dispensing with the complex steam cooling assembly. In its initial form, the PV-12 had a power output of around 1,000 horsepower, a radical improvement on other military engines of the day. All these factors combined to give a revolutionary power-to-weight ratio, perfect for the new monoplane fighter prototypes under construction. This new engine would soon be named the Merlin. Another great designer had also tendered for the F-730 specification and failed. Hawker's chief designer Sidney Cam had therefore decided to rip up the specification and work on a new monoplane fighter also to be powered by the PV-12. But there the similarity with Mitchell stopped. Cam's bottom line was to design a fighter that could utilize many of the jigs and tools that had been used to build the classic Hawker biplanes, the Hart light bomber, and the Fury and Demon fighters. What he came up with was the Hurricane, a classic in its own right, but an aircraft that was traditionally built with wood and fabric, and that would not stand further development. Mitchell, on the other hand, was creating an aircraft that would use new and complex manufacturing techniques. An all-metal monocoque, which held the pilot's seat and controls, was built as a separate section, with a metal engine housing in front and a metal tail section to the rear.
Well, it's amazing to see how well built they were. I mean, they were built in enormous quantities, and the production of them was organised on the lines of the motor industry. It was all made of sub-assemblies that were all put together on a production line, and where parts didn't fit, there was a number of other parts in the production line or in the parts bin that you'd actually put on and would fit. And we do find that from time to time, that some of the parts aren't interchangeable, but there's always enough bits around to get over the problem. But the workmanship, by and large, was pretty good, because it all had to be inspected before the aircraft was accepted by the RAF. It had to be inspected and passed off, so there was a certain standard they had to meet.
The most radical departure of all, though, was the wing. It was made of steel girders of different lengths which slotted into one another. Therefore, at the wing root, where most of the strength was needed, the spar was thickest. As the wing reached the tip, the spar got thinner and lighter. Similarly, the leading edge of the wing was covered in thick metal, which became thinner towards the trailing edge.
Well, there were two things that were special about the wing. First of all, it was quite a thin wing, as wings went in those days. Reginald Mitchell was a genius when it came to that, because it made the Spitfire an extremely fast aircraft. The second major point with the wing was the elliptical shape. Now, that was done specifically to accommodate the four guns on either side, and the elliptical shape enabled you to spread the four guns across the wing, and you had the depth behind the main spar to accommodate the guns.
However, the wing spar itself was a nightmare to manufacture.
A nightmare to produce, because all the tubes had to slot one inside the other, and then the wing was cranked. There was a bend put in the wing about a couple of feet from the root, and this was pressed in, but once that had been done, you couldn't take the tubes apart. And this is where the first problem comes, because when you take an aircraft wing to pieces and you want to inspect the main spar tubes, because of the crank in the wing, you can't get the tubes apart. And the likelihood is that today, 60 years after they were made, that all the wing spars are corroded. And most spars that are taken to pieces, although they may look okay when you look at them from the outside, if you take them apart, if you saw them apart, usually you'll find corrosion inside. So today, it's normal practice to respar the wings.
Supermarine's lack of resources meant that most of the sections had to be put out to manufacture at other companies, causing constant headaches for the assembly teams at the Supermarine factory. On the 6th of March 1936, the new aircraft flew for the first time. The pilot, Mutt Summers, was happy with the first flight, but much work was still needed before the aircraft would be battle-ready. That night, Summers and Supermarine test pilot Jeffrey Quill flew to Brooklands. In the hangar there was the prototype of the Hurricane, which had flown just 4 months earlier. Both aircraft had begun the process that would make them world beaters. The timing of the first flight was somewhat ironic, as the next day Hitler's troops entered the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, his first defiant act against the rest of the world. The clock had begun to tick towards war. The new aircraft was called the Spitfire, the name originally chosen for the unsuccessful gull-wing monoplane. Mitchell himself did not seem happy with the name, but he was aware that the aircraft was going to be a success. He would not, however, live to see his creation fulfill its destiny. Mitchell died from cancer in 1937, leaving a legacy which would make him recognized as one of the greats of the aviation industry. Mitchell's place as chief designer was taken by Joe Smith, who had previously been head of the structures department. He set about turning the aircraft from a prototype into a service fighter.
Under Joe's guidance, the weight of the airplane more or less doubled, the engine power doubled, its speed went up by nearly 50%, and other aspects of performance improved, a rate of roll and rate of climb and things like that, all improved, because they had to. I mean, we had to keep in front of the enemy all the time.
In June 1936, Supermarine received an order for 310 Spitfires, the biggest contract in the company's history. A production line was set up at Woolston in Southampton, and the first production aircraft began leaving the factory in June of 1938. By this time, the Spitfire's performance had been fully developed. Powered by a Merlin II engine, it could achieve a top speed of 362 miles an hour and climb at 2,500 feet per minute to a ceiling of 32,000 feet. This put it at the forefront of military aviation technology. The first squadron to receive Spitfires was number 19 at Duxford, but the production line was slow. It was originally intended to get all the first 310 aircraft in service by March 1938. However, the production problems meant that only 2 squadrons were operational by the beginning of 1939. That year, a further 8 squadrons were equipped, bringing the total to 10 by the outbreak of war. Student pilots couldn't wait to get their first experience of the new aircraft.
When you get into a car, you strap yourself in. Well, you're strapped into a car. When you climbed into a Spitfire, you strapped the Spitfire onto you, and you became part of the Spitfire, and the Spitfire became part of you.
2 surprises. One was that you had been trusted to take this single-seater fighter out and fly it around. The jump from the Harvard to the Spitfire was immense, but that was the first surprise, that you'd actually been entrusted to do this. And the second surprise was that you could actually do it. Growing confidence from the first takeoff onwards. It was kind to young and ignorant airmen.
So we each tootled off to somewhere in the middle of the country and were shown the Spitfire and said, "There it is, take it away." So that was quite amusing, because you probably know that to get the undercarriage off you had to work. It didn't come up by itself. You had to lever like a brake handle, and you pump this to and fro. So when you took off, you started with your right hand on the stick and your left hand on the throttle. You shoved it forward. When you got off the ground, you had to change over and hold the stick with your left hand and pump with your right. The result was that when one went forward, the other went back. So when you saw somebody off on his first sail, inevitably, once the wheels began coming up, it would hunt up and down like this.
But even by September 1939, there were still problems to iron out. Therefore, when the air component of the British Expeditionary Force went to France within days of the declaration of war, the Spitfires stayed at home and did not see combat for a full 8 months. On May the 10th, 1940, Hitler's forces blasted into Belgium, Holland and France. The British fought back, but suffered crippling losses.
It was awful. No other way to put it. You suddenly found yourself up against enormous odds. I'll give you one example. 6 of us ran into 40 Ju-87s one day. We shot down 14 of them, and they ran off. Now, as we left, we were out of ammunition. Another 150 87s came in. It was that thing. We were never overawed by the Germans. We were certainly outnumbered.
By the end of May, the British had retreated to a small pocket around the French coastal town of Dunkirk. Finally, it was the turn of the Spitfires to be tested. The next few days were difficult for the RAF. They were flying at the limit of their range, and Dowding was still trying to conserve his fighter strength for the decisive battle that lay ahead. As it was, over 2,500 sorties were flown across the Channel in 9 days, and many German aircraft were shot down while attempting to bomb and strafe the beaches around Dunkirk.
The main thing is that we were so few. When you remember how far we had to fly, because of our endurance, we didn't have long-range tanks. We could only have perhaps an hour, perhaps less, over there. And to try and keep that up in May, which is sunshine from 5:30 in the morning till, 10, 11 at night, how could we be there all the time?
As Britain licked her wounds, Dowding began to calculate how he would make up the severe losses suffered during the previous month. 432 Spitfires and Hurricanes had been lost, leaving Dowding with just 331 frontline fighters. Even worse was the loss of irreplaceable pilots.
Although we did suffer casualties, it was a situation where higher command could withdraw if they wanted to. Whereas if it had been the Battle of Britain, all the stops had to be pulled out all the time. And without our experience of Dunkirk, the casualties would have been very much higher. The Germans had this experience in Spain. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew about fighting. We were absolutely didn't know a thing. So it was just as well it was short and sharp.
We quickly learnt the Germans' tactics were good. And we'd been taught to fly World War I tactics, tight formations of Vic, to show that we were well disciplined in the air, I suppose, as much as anything. Actual fact, it was a recipe for disaster. If we could have been killed, and we were, picked off. The Germans used to pick us off one by one. We weren't looking behind us. So quickly we learnt the Germans' way of weaving. So then we could always keep looking behind us. We learnt to take our collars and ties off. Because we used to wear the tight Van Heusen collar and on, I think, which incidentally killed a lot of people. When they went in the sea, the collar tightened up. So we learnt that trick, to take it off. Also, by taking the collar off, you could turn your neck more. That is why we learnt more and more looking behind us.
It was obvious that the ensuing Battle of Britain would be a vital encounter. Equally obvious was that the weight of the responsibility for defence would fall on fighter command, for the Luftwaffe would have to clear the skies over England before they could even contemplate invasion. To the Luftwaffe, this did not appear to be a problem. They had never lost a battle, and morale was high. Their pilots were vastly experienced, having begun their fighting in Spain some 4 years before. Since then, no opposing air force had stood a chance against them, and now only Britain stood between them and the total domination of Europe. The Battle of Britain was a momentous period for the whole country. In particular, it was the first time that people could stand and watch dogfights in the skies above their homes. But the pilots who fought those duels were unaware of the bigger picture.
When I first went into battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly on my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, "Break," that meant we were being attacked. And I broke a steep turn, left or right. And I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron. As the war progressed, I'm talking about during the Battle of Britain now, one became more aware. And it was during this period of complete, almost ignorance of not knowing what was happening, to becoming aware, where, of course, you lost the most pilots. If you got over that steep learning curve, you stood a far better chance of survival.
Their main concern was taking on and beating the Messerschmitt Me-109, the German fighter that was their main adversary. The Me-109 was undoubtedly one of the best fighters of the war. Its two 20mm cannon packed a considerable punch and left gaping holes in the aircraft it was attacking. Small, light and aerodynamically efficient, it was powered by a ferocious fuel-injected Daimler-Benz engine that had one vital advantage over the Spitfire.
Well, then again, my own experience was that they just dove away. I don't.
However, the Battle of Britain was not a good time for the Me-109 pilots. They were at the limit of their range, giving them at best 30 minutes of fuel to spare over Britain. To make matters worse, they were told by their commanders that they must not leave the bombers they were escorting. Bomber escort was supposed to be the role of the twin-engine Me-110s. However, it was soon obvious that they were no match for marauding RAF fighters. This meant that the 109s had to escort the escorts. But with a force which numbered almost 3,000 aircraft against a combined fighter defence in Britain of barely 900, it seemed only a matter of time before Britain would finally succumb. Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's commander, had, however, seriously underestimated the RAF's capabilities. While accurately assessing the total strength, they were way out on replacement figures, assuming that the rate of fighter output was well below the actual 400-plus aircraft per month. They also badly undervalued both the Spitfire and the Hurricane. But worst of all, they had no conception of the home defence organisation that had been created painstakingly during the pre-war years. The key to this defence was radar. This pre-war invention had led to the establishment of a chain of radar stations around the east and south coasts of Britain, from the north of Scotland to Wales. Their role was to plot the build-up of enemy aircraft across the Channel and to give early warning of attack. Once the enemy crossed the coast, the Royal Observer Corps took up visual tracking, providing detailed information of numbers, height and direction to Fighter Command, Group and Sector stations.
Hostile 46, Northwest Willie Victor, 7542, Willie Victor,
September
7542, 100 plus at 14.
Yes, Brompton. Yes, there is a major raid developing to the southeast. Height 15,000. Coming in on a bearing of 100.
This gave the squadrons time to scramble their fighters so that they could gain height and intercept the enemy aircraft.
Tea time on a Sunday. I don't know why. The Germans used to love that. tea time, they used to mass up. We could see them forming up on their, well, our radar boys could see them, and they used to tell us, oh, they're forming up now. And they used to start their bomber formations over the coast of France. We used to see them over there from our top. And then we used to finish off our tea, get near our aircraft, and we'd take off ready. And when the scramble, always use the word scramble. We used to scramble when we were told to, and told to go. In our main thing, it was over Weymouth, of all places, because that's where the Navy had its oil tanks. They don't know that, but I suppose they're taken away by now. But the Germans were always trying to hit the oil tanks. And it gave us time when I was at Exeter, before I moved to Tangier. You had time to finish your tea, have a wash, and then get cheerfully ready to, so you're really ready for them.
The battle began with a succession of attacks against shipping in the Channel and raids against coastal targets. While waiting for Hitler's go-ahead for the main attacks, the Luftwaffe sought to probe Britain's defences and bring the Spitfires and Hurricanes to battle. This gave Dowding a difficult decision to make: defend the ships and lose fighters, or husband his resources and leave the shipping to the mercy of the Stukas. By the end of July, Fighter Command had lost 118 aircraft. These were always replaced, but 80 squadron commanders had been killed, leaving Dowding with inexperienced pilots to fill the gaps. It was also apparent that Fighter Command's tactics were quite wrong.
As regards to tactics and formations, remember my rank at the time, we used to fly in formations of 3, which was a very clumsy way of flying, which I learned later on, of course. But probably the one disaster area in combat at that time, and I'm talked about when I was with 41 Squadron, was they used to have a weaver top and bottom, who was normally a sergeant pilot, and you would weave and give top cover to the squadron. But to keep up with them and weave, you were losing more petrol than they were, and suddenly the squadron leader would turn off in one direction and you'd turned off in another, so then you had to go straight, fly straight and level to try and keep up, which was a rather hazardous procedure. So, no, tactics in the units I served in were pre-war.
However, the changes in tactics only served to get the fighters to the combat. Once they reached the enemy, they trusted in their own skills and the performance of their aircraft to shoot down the enemy.
Indianer, rechts voraus! Kontakt. Spitfire. Wo sind Sie? Haben Sie noch Sichtkontakt? Ja, 11 Uhr tief. Gehen Sie in Schussposition. Okay, verstanden. Schieß doch, schieß doch! Kann nicht! Auf, jetzt wird! Sah gut aus. Daneben. Haben Sie noch Sichtkontakt? Ja, aus der Sonne. Jetzt. Gut, sah gut aus. Sicht, getroffen. Horrido. Wo ist die zweite? Ich glaube, die ist nach Norden abgetreten, nach Menschen. So lassen Sie uns nach Hause führen. Mein Benzin geht sowieso zur Neige. Guter Kampf, mein Freund. Ein Abschnitt mehr. Vorsicht, mit da, mein Motor setzt aus. Ziehen Sie! Ich muss runter, mein Motor setzt aus. Ich muss runter. Steigen Sie aus, steigen Sie aus. Ich kann nicht steuern. Ich muss abdrehen. Zurück nach Hause, mein Sprit ist zu Ende.
I must have been in some sort of dogfight, and everything had gone, and I looked around, and over there something was going on, so I charged over there, and there was a milling going on, so I went straight in towards the milling and chose a target, and as soon as I chose a target, it went by, you see, it hit more or less head on, so I chose another one, and that went by head on, another one underneath. Oh, I can't get at anything here, what the hell? Oh, I realized I was in a circus, so to speak, and I was going the wrong way round. So I pulled up to an immovable turn, as they call it, straight up to lose speed and down again. And then I was in the circus, and I could pick one up. The idea of, these things are happening, and collisions possible, and not realizing that one's in the circus going the wrong way around. They were 110s mostly, and they had a rear gunner, so it was quite useful for them to go into a circle to defend their entails, and at the same time to be able to shoot back at whatever was going on. But I never thought of adopting a circular motion with other Spitfires.
On August the 13th, Göring switched tactics. Instead of concentrating on the fighters in the air, he turned initially to attacking the defense system of sector and radar stations. This was followed by an attempt to destroy the RAF by bombing airfields and armament factories. It was the critical phase of the battle. Had these attacks been pressed home continuously, Fighter Command would have either been destroyed or would have fallen back from their airfields in the southeast. This would have given the Luftwaffe air superiority and opened the door for invasion. But suddenly these attacks stopped. On September the 7th, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its first attack on London, wrongly assuming they could break the will of the British people. On Sunday the 15th of September, the air struggle reached its peak. German bomber crews had been informed that Fighter Command was a virtually non-existent force and that their way through to London would be easy. Their illusion was soon cruelly shattered.
Operations calling. Operations calling. Keter and Jaunty squadrons scramble. Keter and Jaunty squadrons scramble. Vector 140, Angels 20. Tennis squadron scramble. Tennis squadron scramble. Patrol Canterbury, Angels 20.
Jack, Keter leader calling. Tally ho, tally ho. Mike calls with 109 dead ahead. Mike, God, there's hundreds of the baskets. Never seen so many.
During the afternoon, more than 300 Spitfires and Hurricanes hacked the German formations. 56 bombers were destroyed, and dozens more returned to base with dead engines and dying crews. The route from London to the Channel was littered with German aircraft and German ambition. The date became known as Battle of Britain Day. It was the greatest day yet for Fighter Command, and for the few who had contested the battle. The invasion was postponed and then cancelled altogether. Britain would still suffer under a terrible onslaught of bombing raids, but the mainland was secure. Pilots remember the battle in many different, intensely personal ways.
The battle bit afterwards has become a famous thing, just because of the words, apart from anything else. And looking back, it was a very important occasion, and yes, it did save us until the Americans came in. But at the time, everybody was at war. It just happened that we were the people, the Air Force at the time was in the thick of it, and other people weren't. But they all knew that, I mean, people were getting prepared to defend the beaches. They'd be just as heroic as we had been if they'd been attacked. It wasn't until afterwards that it was realised quite how important the situation was.
Being dead tired, really tired. I don't mean just tired. One was really tired. It was a funny feeling. Perhaps it was being on readiness when you weren't actually flying, but one was tired. And it's very hard to tell people this. Don't say you're exhausted. You're not, but you're very tired. I think, luckily, I had to do most of my fighting when I was a young man. I wouldn't like to do it as an older man.
Waiting for that telephone to ring was the most exhausting part of being a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. When it rang, it may suddenly, the message may be, the naffy's here with tea, which was you enjoyed the tea, but it was somewhat shattering. When it rang and you were scrambled, it was a wonderful relief. Once you were strapped in the aircraft, in it, then you felt, you know, we're on our way, we're doing something. So tension and tiredness, you know, very much linked together.
By 1940, the Supermarine factory was working to capacity. Spitfires were being turned out in their hundreds. But towards the end of the year, disaster struck. In September, the Supermarine works at Itchen and Woolston were badly damaged by bombing raids. Working out of new headquarters at Hursley Park near Winchester, the Spitfire design team and management drew up a plan to disperse production across the south of England.
Lorries came along and picked up everything that was undamaged and a lot of stuff that was damaged. And took away quickly. I mean, we took over bus stations, and we actually took over a laundry in one place, a factory which made steamrollers and all sorts of things. And within a couple of weeks, there were aircraft were actually coming off the line again. And I don't know exactly. There are some records of this, and I don't know exactly how long it took, but it wasn't very long before the production was up to standard again.
The development of the Spitfire also continued at a pace. Uprated engines, pushing the speed to 375 miles an hour, powered the Mark II that appeared at the end of 1940. This was rapidly followed by the Mark V in February 1941. This became the most numerous of all Spitfire variants and equipped no fewer than 117 RAF squadrons in the UK and overseas. When the Mark V became available, Fighter Command went on the offensive. They had been on the defensive since the Battle for France, and it was felt that pilots needed experience of taking the war to the Luftwaffe. Small formations of bombers, escorted by fighters, were sent over France to tempt German fighters into the skies. The Mark V was also the first Spitfire to carry bombs.
First the Hurricane, and now the Spitfire becomes a maid-of-all work. The latest pictures of the world's finest fighter shows her adapted for close support shallow dive bombing. In its new form, carrying one 250-pound bomb and 4 cannons, the Spitfire becomes an additional threat to Axis transport, supply dumps and shipping. As yet, a South African wing composed entirely of South African pilots is the only one using these new Spitfire bombers. They have been carrying out great work both on the 8th Army Front and across the Adriatic Sea into Yugoslavia.
At the end of 1941, a new menace appeared in European skies. The Focke-Wulf 190 had a profound effect on Fighter Command. Spitfire Mark V's were lost at an alarming rate even before it was established that Germany had introduced a superior fighter. The answer was yet another Spitfire, the Mark IX. Hastily putting a new 1,660 horsepower Merlin 61 engine into a Mark V airframe, Supermarine created what was supposed to be an interim aircraft.
When we got the nines with the spooster supercharged, extra super, I mean, all of them had supercharged, there was an extra booster, but you could only bring it in at altitude. That was wonderful because you could see a 109, say, a mile away, and you knew if he didn't see you, you could catch him up. That was really satisfying. It's a wonderful feeling. I'm gaining. Of course, when you get to that stage, Now, the learning curve, you've completed it, and you're fairly confident, you're aware what's going on. That's when the trouble starts. That's when you start getting hit again.
The Mark IX's first major operation was in support of the raid on Dieppe on August the 19th, 1942. And it was a fierce baptism of fire. 600 RAF fighters engaged hordes of FW-190s and ME-109Gs in a battle the like of which had not been seen since the summer of 1940. The Mark IX stayed in service with the RAF until after the end of the war, a remarkable feat for a stopgap aircraft. By the end of 1942, it was obvious to the designers at Supermarine that the Merlin engine had come to the end of its development. For some years, they had been experimenting with a new Rolls-Royce engine, the Griffon, which had been developed directly from the old R-series engines of the Schneider-Trevi aircraft. Joe Smith's team began redesigning the nose of the Spitfire to accommodate the bigger engine. The definitive Griffon engine fighter was the Mark XIV, a real beast of an aircraft with a stunning performance. A top speed in level flight of 439 miles an hour and a diving speed of around 500 put it at the very limit of piston engine flight possibilities.
The 14 was an extraordinary airplane. It was really so powerful. It made such a noise, even in the cockpit. It was like flying a motorbike. That was my feeling about it. You were certainly one with the airplane, and when you pushed the foot, really, you were moved. It was great. But it had these even worse problems with the effect on the controls. In fact, just for amusement, you had to be careful when taking off that it didn't swing, you see. So for amusement, I thought I'd work out how you could get off as quick as possible. So what I did was to, I can't remember which foot it was, supposing it was the left foot, I turned into the upwind and I put my left foot full right round like that. Then I'd open the throttle until it began to move, and then I'd keep it there, and as the speed increased, so I could get the throttle forward. So by having my foot already fully in the rudder, I was having maximum energy to get off the ground. And also, when I did that, and I opened it quickly, the wing would drop, because the wheels are fairly close together, and there was such torque, it was enough to turn the aeroplane in the opposite direction. So it was, for the size of the aeroplane, it was a very powerful engine.
The prowess of the Mark XIV was such that after D-Day, it was used to shoot down V-1 flying bombs that began raining down on Britain in June 1944. One example also gained the first victory over a German jet fighter. The continuous development of the Spitfire over the war years meant that they could be used for other roles. Photographic reconnaissance was a vital task, which was undertaken later in the war by the Spitfire PR-19. This was a development of the 14, but without armament. It meant that the aircraft had the space and weight to carry extra fuel in the wings, vastly improving its range. For the pilot to take advantage of the ceiling of more than 40,000 feet, one of the first pressurized cockpits was introduced. There were, however, points in the war when the Spitfire began to show its limitations. This was mainly due to two factors. First, the Spitfire fighters always suffered from short range. By the middle of the war, when large streams of American bombers were suffering at the hands of the German fighters, an escort fighter was desperately needed to accompany them all the way to the target and back. The Spitfire was never able to fulfill this role. Instead, it went to the North American P-51 Mustang, a superb fighter, powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine, which had a range of 1,300 miles. Second, the Spitfire was never able to get to grips with ground attack. The stress poured onto the thin wing meant that some crashed, and many went back to the factory with damaged leading edges. The prime aircraft for this role was the Hawker Typhoon, which had a massive, thick wing and could easily withstand the buffeting at low level. However, the Supermarine team continued to produce new, improved marks of Spitfire until the last, the 24, appeared in 1948. Fighter pilots, though, have definite opinions on the value of these later variants. More than 20,000 Spitfires were produced in the 10 years from 1938. 22,000 men and women were employed by Supermarine and their subcontractors to build them. Thousands of pilots flew them, and many more maintained them. But the Spitfire was a wartime aircraft, and like many others, it could so easily be remembered by a few examples in museums. But it had gained a special place in aviation history, and no one was prepared to let it die.
If you compare the technical problems to a frontline fighter squadron, Tornado Squadron, where they have, largely speaking, everything that they need in terms of spares on the rack, it doesn't necessarily follow that we can do the same thing. Their operation is, largely speaking, they identify a fault, they change the black box, and it's solved. There are no black boxes in any of the aeroplanes which we have, and the spares are obviously rare, desirable, and can only be got on a sort of who you know, who you're prepared to exchange with basis, or can you manufacture them? Did the Air Force have the foresight to store them in the first place, and that sort of thing. And it is really, it's pure engineering rather than what frontlines largely become in terms of technical replacement. The long-term future, if I might go on to that, you can always repair airframes, that is, you know, the basic wings, fuselage, all the rest of it. You can indeed buy Spitfire main spars for the wings straight off the shelf, because there is, you know, a flourishing market in civil Spitfires. What will eventually ground it is when you can no longer refurbish the engines, because there are no acceptable replacements, and these have now gone in excess of 50 years, and you obviously can't go on forever. So that will probably be the final demise, but that is actually, we think, a fair way off in the future.
The popularity of the Spitfire in the present day, and the enthusiasm for it wherever it performs, and the books that have been written about it, truly amaze me. Because probably even in 1950, if you'd said to me, was this going to happen? I'd have said no.
60 years after the Spitfire entered service with the RAF, more than 50 examples are still in flying condition. Many more are under restoration. And they are still the most popular aircraft at air shows all over the world.
Like a boat. You look at it and you say, that boat can sail. You look at a Spitfire, you say, the Spitfire fly. It's got to be a wonderful aircraft. And so I think even designers of the future can look at it and learn something from it, because if a thing looks right, it normally is.
A radical improvement on other military engines of the day. All these factors combined to give a revolutionary power-to-weight ratio, perfect for the new monoplane fighter prototypes under construction. This new engine would soon be named the Merlin. Another great designer had also tendered for the F730 specification and failed. Hawker's chief designer Sidney Cam had therefore decided to rip up the specification and work on a new monoplane fighter also to be powered by the PV-12. But there the similarity with Mitchell stopped. Cam's bottom line was to design a fighter that could utilize many of the jigs and tools that had been used to build the classic Hawker biplanes, the Hart light bomber, and the Fury and Demon fighters. What he came up with was the Hurricane, a classic in its own right, but an aircraft that was traditionally built with wood and fabric, and that would not stand further development. Mitchell, on the other hand, was creating an aircraft that would use new and complex manufacturing techniques. An all-metal monocoque, which held the pilot's seat and controls, was built as a separate section, with a metal engine housing in front and a metal tail section to the rear.
Well, it's amazing to see how well built they were. I mean, they were built in enormous quantities, and the production of them was organised on the lines of the motor industry. It was all made of sub-assemblies that were all put together on a production line, and
Equally important was the appointment of men such as Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding to positions of authority. He, amongst others, believed that not only could the bomber be stopped, but must be stopped. While the design of new monoplane bombers continued apace, he also pushed for new fighters. By 1933, Mitchell was already well advanced with the design of a new monoplane fighter in response to an Air Ministry specification. His entry was a gull-wing monoplane with a fixed undercarriage and open cockpit. It was powered by a Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine which used a complicated steam cooling device. But Mitchell was not happy. The Air Ministry ordered a biplane, the Gloucester Gladiator, and Mitchell went back to the drawing board. As Mitchell contemplated revolutionary design features to his airframe, so Rolls-Royce were designing a new privately funded engine, the PV-12. Using the research that had made the Schneider engine so successful, Rolls-Royce built a classic. New chemicals improved the fuels, and better fuels improved the superchargers. This meant that the engine could provide extra power at altitudes where normal engines ran out of steam in the thin air. New, stronger metals meant that the power could be sustained but at a fraction of the weight. The V-12 inline layout was liquid-cooled, dispensing with the complex steam cooling assembly. In its initial form, the PV-12 had a power output of around 1,000 horsepower. The Spitfire is a legend. Today, 60 years after it first entered service with the RAF, it still turns heads and raises emotions with its classic lines and the full-throated roar of its Merlin engine. But the Spitfire was more than just a good-looking aircraft. It was a killer, a fighter of immense character that became the chosen mount for many of the best fighter pilots the RAF could muster. But perhaps most important of all, the Spitfire's design allowed it to be developed constantly throughout its 10 years of manufacture. Bigger engines, more power, and improved armament kept the Spitfire in the front line well after its contemporaries had disappeared. It is not surprising, therefore, that every fighter to carry the RAF roundels since the war has been compared with the Spitfire. The genesis of the Spitfire's success lay in the abilities and leadership of two men, R.J. Mitchell, the chief designer of Supermarine Aviation, and Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce Engines. Their relationship had begun during the preparation for the 1929 Schneider Trophy race. Air racing was hugely popular, and the Schneider Trophy was the blue ribboned event in the racing calendar. Mitchell and Royce set out to create a world beater. The Supermarine S6 won that year, and in 1931 the S6B completed the trio of wins needed to secure the trophy for Britain forever. Three factors were significant in this win. First, the 1931 victory was accomplished without any government backing. Lady Houston, the widow of a shipping magnate, stepped in and donated £100,000 from her own pocket. Second, Mitchell had almost single-handedly brought the concept of the monoplane to the forefront of British aircraft design. Finally, and most worrying to the RAF, the S6B had won the race at a speed of 340 miles an hour and went on to break the world speed record just a few days later. At 407 miles an hour, this streamlined monoplane, powered by a privately built engine, had flown around 200 miles an hour faster than the RAF's fastest frontline fighter.
It left us with the design and aerodynamic knowledge to go on to high-speed aircraft. And of course from that the Spitfire finally evolved.
Since the First World War, Britain's defence budgets had been small. Hugh Trenchard, the RAF's first commander, had spent his precious pounds on building a bomber force at the expense of fighters. This had stood him in good stead throughout the 1920s, when the RAF had virtually been in control of policing the British Empire. Trenchard, however, did understand the need for fighters. Light biplane bombers had quelled local uprisings in India and Iraq with ease, and it seemed that there was no need for faster and more expensive aircraft. But in the early 1930s, Europe was far from being a continent at peace. In Germany, Adolf Hitler came to power, pulled out of the Geneva Disarmament Conference, and declared that he would rebuild the Luftwaffe. In comparison to Britain, Hitler spent enormous sums of money on new aircraft and pilot training. The German civil airline, Lufthansa, and German gliding clubs had already become breeding grounds for the pilots who would spearhead the Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the RAF was resting on its laurels and undertaking exercises with lumbering heavy bombers, which could easily penetrate the fighter defences at 80 miles an hour. If Britain was to have any chance in a war with Germany, then something had to happen quickly. On the 21st of October 1933, Winston Churchill spoke to the House of Commons. Germany is already well on her way to become, and must become, incomparably the most heavily armed nation in the world, and the nation most ready for war. We cannot have any anxieties comparable to the anxiety caused by German rearmament. In response to this, and the obvious warlike posture of Adolf Hitler, the British government gradually increased the defence budget.